right, good morning, everybody. So we're moving on to a new topic today, and we're talking about externalities. Not sure if those of you in science have been introduced to that idea. You have? Good. Well, some of you probably were introduced to it in your principles of microeconomics class as well. We're going to definitely kick it up a few notches, and probably it was done descriptively in some of your other classes. We're actually going to talk about the theory of externalities and look at graphs. All right? So we're going to begin by talking about the definition. What do we mean when we talk about an externality? So let's define it, and then we'll look at some examples, make sure we understand it, then we'll treat it graphically. So the formal definition says that in the process of production, distribution, or consumption, so the three sources, in the process of production, distribution, or consumption of certain goods, there are beneficial or harmful side effects So in the process of production, distribution, or consumption of certain goods, there are beneficial or harmful side effects borne by individuals not directly involved in the market exchange. So in the process of production, distribution, or consumption of certain goods, there are beneficial or harmful side effects borne by individuals who are not directly involved in the market exchange. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that we generally think about three ways that externalities are generated. So we have some examples from production, from distribution, and from consumption. We'll go over some of those. But we also need to understand that sometimes these externalities are beneficial and sometimes they're harmful. So we actually divide it into what we call positive externalities. So these are going to be the ones creating benefits. Or you might see it referred to as an external benefit, or harmful side effects, which we refer to as negative externalities, or external costs. Question?
What is that word right before by individuals?
Borne by individuals, not directly involved in the market exchange. Sorry, I write and then it like disappears, so I don't know what's going on. The reason is that there's this little pen, has a button right where your fingers go, and you click it and it erases, so I apologize. So guys, we need to talk about both positive externalities and negative externalities. A third thing that we need to note is that it's borne by individuals not directly involved in the market exchange. So we can think of these people as kind of innocent bystanders. Somehow they're not doing anything, but there's a cost or a benefit that they either realize or is imposed upon them. So for that reason, when we think about that these are costs that somehow spill over to others, you might see them referred to as spillover effects. So you might see us call them spillover costs and benefits. So in the process of production, distribution, or consumption of certain things, we've got the beneficial or harmful side effects. So we're saying we create external benefits or external costs, and they're spilling over to others that aren't involved in the process. They're kind of innocent bystanders. So let's go up to the first point that we made, and that is that we have some externalities that are coming from production, distribution, and consumption. So a good example, if we were thinking about production, might be emissions from a smokestack. So do you agree, guys? You live downwind from a factory, and they're polluting, and air quality is being reduced. And you, as somebody who just happens to own a house near the factory, has a cost imposed on you. This is an external cost or a negative externality. What might be an example for distribution? Distribution. When we distribute certain things.
The pollution from like the trucks.
Yeah, sure. So we've got car, truck. So we distribute things by cars, by trucks, and they're creating a source of pollution. Now it's a mobile source of pollution rather than a point source of pollution like that smokestack, but do you agree that, for example, driving creates an externality? So driving creates a negative externality. What might be an example of consumption?
Like waste products?
I'm talking about I consume something and it creates an externality for you. So tell me what you mean by waste products.
Like trash. Like nobody likes to deal with like a whole bunch of trash. That has to go somewhere, right? That's an externality technically.
Yeah, so possibly the trash that results. So if I'm consuming things and I'm littering, if I'm, means things have to go to the dump and you live near the dump, that could be an example. You had your hand up, Xavier.
I think like a flu vaccine.
Okay, so we could be seeing something like a vaccine. So I get a shot for the flu. Does that benefit you?
Yes.
Hurt you?
Yeah.
Benefit you? How does it benefit you?
Because I won't catch whatever.
I'm less likely to get you sick, right? So could vaccines create positive externalities? Absolutely. Other examples? Yeah.
Maybe overfishing.
Overfishing?
Yeah. Like consuming like.
Sure. So you're a commercial fisherman, you're overfishing, and now you're imposing costs on me, some person who just wants to throw their fishing rod into the water because that's how I feed my family in my developing country. The one I was thinking about was secondhand smoke. But you guys gave some great examples. So secondhand smoke, I smoke a cigarette, and you guys have to deal with secondhand smoke. So I've imposed a negative externality on you. Now, the last thing that we have to get our brain around is this part about not directly involved in the market exchange. We call them externalities because these are costs and benefits that are not captured in the market. These are costs and benefits not captured in the market. For example, when we price cigarettes, when the market prices cigarettes, guys, does the market say, you know what, cigarettes create secondhand smoke, so we should charge people more to smoke them? Does the market do that? No. And when we price trucks or gas, we might have an environmental tax on it, but does the market say gas creates pollution, so the market price of gas should be higher? Does the market do that? No. So it's important to understand, why are we calling these externalities? The term external is really important in understanding externalities. So since these are costs and benefits not captured in the marketplace, they go uninternalized. They go uninternalized by the market. In other words, what we mean when we say they go uninternalized by the market is that price that's established in the market doesn't capture these costs or benefits. Now there might be some things that we do that help us to capture them. For example, a government tax could be used right? We can use a government tax to try to capture an externality, but is that the market? Is that a market process? No. So we want to be clear, we don't want to confuse these two, that when we say we're going to use a tax on gas because gas is polluting and we want to put an environmental tax in place, that's government. It's not the market. So what we're saying is that the market function can't address externalities. Government can, but the market can't. Yeah?
Did you make an argument that, say, like, well, obviously, like, cigarettes is kind of a bad example because people are addicted to it, but say we know that cigarettes can cause lung cancer, and that would decrease demand. That would be
so right? Cigarettes cause lung cancer.
Yeah.
Is that an externality? Look at the definition. Cigarettes are causing lung cancer for the user.
It's like a hand smoke.
Well, we're talking about, oh, you're saying the secondhand smoke.
Yeah.
Okay. So we need to make a distinction. What was that?
They're directly involved.
Yeah, so we have to make a distinction. Who's lung cancer? So if I'm smoking and I get lung cancer, that's not necessarily an externality in the same sense. It's not really a spillover. It's impacting me. But again, the market doesn't increase the price because of that. If I smoke and I'm giving you lung cancer, maybe we're married and I'm smoking in the house all the time and now you get cancer, has the market addressed that?
But since less people are smoking because they're aware of the negative health effects,
that's
doesn't that
something.
necessarily mean
Maybe
the
like-
market is changing its demand and that demand
Okay,
will
so,
change its
okay, I
price?
see where you're going.
Yeah.
So you're arguing
That's like-
that people care about their health, and so for that reason, they might choose to make decisions. And there might be some of that. I'm not suggesting that people don't respond to non-market costs. They do. Would I necessarily say that the market has internalized the externality? Not necessarily. I mean, maybe demand for cigarettes goes down because now we care about our children and I care about my own health. And so maybe demand has gone down for cigarettes, but not enough to eliminate the externality. By the same reason, we might have a firm that decides to voluntarily install some new technology. Are they going to eliminate the externality? Are they going to voluntarily, without any regulations imposed upon them, impose on themselves those costs needed to completely eliminate the externality? No. So demand going down and firms voluntarily doing certain things can decrease the size of the externality. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the market at work solving the externality. That's people's preferences changing. It's a function of people's behavior. But the market hasn't literally said, we need to absorb this externality. If you're going to smoke, you have to pay the price. The market's not saying that. So I would model them slightly differently. So let's continue, and I think it will help you kind of understand where we're going with this. All right, so let's take a very simple example, and then maybe we can kind of see the distinction between me kind of voluntarily, changing my behavior for my own benefit, or me needing the market to impose a cost upon me. And those are two different approaches, right? So let's look at a simple example, and we're going to use very simple graphical tools here. And let's say that we're talking about, let's stick with the secondhand smoke. So consumption of cigarettes. So when we model this, let's use just very simple marginal benefit, marginal cost analysis, all right, at the individual level. So let's say that the marginal benefits for you are diminishing. That makes sense, right? We usually model diminishing marginal benefits, diminishing returns. As you smoke more and more cigarettes, your marginal benefits are probably decreasing. And your marginal costs could be constant, they could be increasing. Let's just model it this way to be very simple. So in your decision process, you've got basically a certain price, certain dollar value, and an optimal quantity of cigarettes that you're going to smoke. Now, your decision process is really simple. So if you're a rational agent, you're going to compare your marginal benefits and marginal costs, and we know that if marginal benefits are greater than or equal to marginal costs, then it's rational to consume. And if marginal benefits are less than marginal cost, then we know it's irrational, right? This is our simple model of optimality. So this is how we would define rational behavior in this case. And so this is how I make my decisions. Generally, guys, and I'm not saying there aren't exceptions, and you said, you know, some people might say, okay, wow, I'm creating secondhand smoke and I care about people around me. But do you think the general person in the market operates that way? Do you think the general person in the market would make that kind of decision? Just in a simple market process, I'm buying cigarettes. Do you think the average person says, I'm going to buy less cigarettes? And I'm not saying some people don't give up smoking and that we haven't seen a demand in cigarettes, but I'm saying for somebody who is a consumer of cigarettes, do they say, consumers, or as I consume, other people are affected, so I need to internalize that. I need to weigh that into my decision process. Do we think that people behave that way?
Maybe like in families.
Yeah, maybe within my own house, you know, something like that, or where I smoke, right? But I think in general, when we want to think about the process of buying something that generates an externality, we're probably not thinking about that spillover cost. So if we model this as ignoring the spillover cost, then we have a decision where they consume, let's call it Q0 units of cigarettes. But what if they did internalize the externality? What if they do internalize it? So this would be somebody saying, I do care about all of the people around me. So this is kind of what you're suggesting, that some people do care about the health of others. And if they do internalize the externality, then their decision's a little bit different. So we would have to model this slightly differently. We would have to say, okay, there's some externality that we need to add in here. So I'm thinking about marginal cost plus the marginal external cost. So I'm looking at external cost marginally, incrementally. So if I do think about this, now I want to consume this many cigarettes. And I agree, Brandon, you're arguing that some people are going to think this way, right?
Would a better example be, the cigarettes is a bad example, but say there's like a food plant and they pollute and it gets in the water stream and the people nearby get cancer from that pollution.
Sure. We could use pollution downstream, from dumping. We could do the same kind of analysis.
But the demand.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying with cigarettes, people have been a little influenced over time to think about the health effects, and we have seen a demand decrease. But I would argue that if we've seen a demand decrease for cigarettes, that we haven't seen the externality going away. What have we seen? Maybe the total externality shrink. as the consumption of cigarettes decreases. But let's stick to this for right now. Do we agree that the average person probably doesn't think this way? Do we think the average person incorporates the externality? No, probably not.
So the graph is saying that like people are internalizing the externality and making changes in their behavior.
No, I really don't want to go down the route that Brandon is suggesting. I'm saying that if people ignore the externality,
The secondhand smoke.
they're going to, if the secondhand smoke does not come into play in my decision process, if I don't think about the cost that I'm imposing on you, then I'm consuming Q0 cigarettes. Where do we want people to operate? We'd rather have people operate at Q1. Some people might be, but not everyone's operating that way, right? So we would call this for efficiency. We want to be at Q1. Do we agree that at Q1, the externality has been internalized? And we see this two ways. First, what's happened to quantity? What's happened to quantity? Quantity has gone down. And if we were drawing a market here, what would be happening to price? BP1, right? So what we're saying is, and again, you need to be very clear, for efficiency, if we want to have a situation of efficiency, the externality has to be internalized, which means people would consume less and price would have to be higher, right? In other words, we're back to something we talked about a long time ago. You guys remember our discussion of the polluter pays principle? That those people who generate the environmental damage should have to pay for it? Well, this would be an example of the polluter pays principle, that the price should be P1 instead of P0, because P1 incorporates the externality, P0 doesn't. Everybody with me so far? But here's the problem. Here's the problem. Can the market I'm not talking about government, but can the market operate this way? Can the market force people to internalize that externality? Can the market force people to internalize that externality? No. What do markets do? Markets work on supply and demand, right? And if markets work on supply and demand, that externality goes ignored. It gets unincorporated. It's not going to be on this graph, right? The market can't force people to think about the purple marginal cost curve that incorporates the externality. They can't change the way that people behave, how they make their decisions. So, as such, we would say that the market fails to incorporate the externality. The market fails to incorporate the externality, which means in this case, the market outcome is inefficient. Put a big star by that. The market outcome is inefficient. Let's take it a step further and look at the same thing, but let's extrapolate to, instead of one person, let's think about a model with supply and demand. Did everyone get that? Everyone caught up with me? So let's look at the same thing. And again, we could be talking about another example. Let's say that we have a factory that emits pollution. And it imposes an externality. On some downstream, downwind community. All right, so a factory emits pollution and imposes some externality downstream. So let's look at our market for this good. Let's call it good X. So good X being produced generates a negative externality. Now we know how to draw a market, right? We have a downward sloping demand curve, and we have an upward sloping supply curve. And it's going to help us out tremendously if we remember a couple things. Demand curves are really nothing more than the sum of the individual marginal benefits, right? That's what a demand curve is. It's the sum of the individual marginal benefits. And a supply curve captures the marginal cost for the industry. So we've basically got marginal cost and marginal benefit in the form of supply and demand. So same story. We know that the market is going to operate at the intersection of supply and demand. So it's going to set a price P0 and a quantity exchanged of Q0. But we have the same scenario. This supply curve captures the marginal cost for the industry. So that's going to include things like labor and raw materials. Things that we think about as being real costs where money changes hands. So my question for you is, that supply curve, does it incorporate the pollution? Does that supply curve in the market incorporate the pollution?
No.
No. So what it doesn't capture is the pollution. Right? Now, I'm not saying they've installed new technology. That would be a real cost, right? But guys, in this graph right here, because some of you are kind of looking skeptical, our supply curve, do supply curves capture the intangible costs like pollution? So if every unit of X that we produce generates some particulate matter coming out of the smokestack, does that cost appear in this graph anywhere? Is that how markets operate? And we're assuming that they're not doing anything about it. There's no cost from new technology they're imposing. So these costs, unless there's some requirement that they're addressing it, or if they're choosing to address it, these costs aren't captured, right? So let's make sure we're clear about that. These costs aren't captured. So let's say we know how much pollution is. We can calculate it and we can estimate it as a dollar figure. So let's suppose that we can estimate the costs. So we can estimate the externality. And I would need to do it kind of by unit. So let's suppose we can estimate the external cost. Guys, do you think that people have studied this kind of stuff? Estimating the dollar value of an external cost? Of course. So let's say we determine, let's keep it simple, that we have a fixed cost for each amount of pollution. And when we add that in, so this right here would be our external costs per unit. Right? So that's our marginal external cost. So now we have a new supply curve. It's our real costs like labor and raw materials where money exchanges hands, added in with our marginal external cost. So this gives us a supply curve, we'll call it S1. So we've added the supply curve to marginal external cost to get a supply curve S1. Let's call this the social supply curve. Because it incorporates the externality. So, as a society, folks, where do we really want to operate here in this market? Where do we want to operate?
On the social supply.
Yeah, we'd rather operate on this social supply where decision making has taken into account this externality that's being created, which means price should be P1 and quantity should be Q1. So we have to compare. We have a market outcome, and then we have a socially optimal outcome. So we have a market outcome, and we have a socially optimal outcome. And they give us different prices and different quantity. So the market's going to operate at what price, guys? The market's going to operate where? What price? The market's going to set what price?
P0.
P0, right? Because it operates on the black supply curve that incorporates the actual cost of production. Labor, energy, raw materials. And the market is going to end up with how many units being exchanged? Q0. But the socially optimal level is different, right? So what price is socially optimal to charge for X? P1. And what quantity is socially optimal? Q1. So we have a situation here. The market outcome is not the socially optimal outcome. Now guys, let's think about this for a second. The market's not being efficient. Is that what we taught you in Econ 217? Didn't we always say, God, generally markets are efficient. Economists like markets. So we have a situation here of what we call, everyone caught up to me? We have a situation of what we call market failure. So externalities are our first example of market failure. Externalities generate market failure. when externalities are present, we end up with market failure. So what is it that we mean by market failure? Is the market broken? Still operating, right? Generated a price of P0 and Q0, so we want to be very clear. The market is still operating. It's not broken, so we want to be careful in our language. We don't want to say that the market's broken, because the market is operating just as it would.
It fails to capture like the realistic.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're saying is the market fails to capture all of the relevant costs of production So the market fails to capture all of the relevant costs of production. In other words, it can't internalize the externality. And so we end up with an outcome that is not socially optimal. Or efficient. Yeah.
I just have a question.
Uh-huh.
Underneath where it says market fails to capture all of the relevant costs of
Mhm.
production, would benefits be put in there as well? Since
Well, this is an example of external costs.
Costs.
So we're not talking about benefits right now.
Okay.
So let's stick to just costs, because
okay.
this is an external cost example, right? Because we're talking about pollution from a smokestack. Okay? We'll look at the same thing for a benefit. So guys, the presence of externalities results in market failure. We need to understand that. So markets aren't always perfect. Markets aren't always efficient. Occasionally, in some scenarios, markets don't have the ability to make socially optimal decisions. And this is an example. So help me understand intuitively what's causing this. So why? If you were trying to explain this to somebody who's not an economist and you're not talking about demand and supply curves, how would you explain why the market can't internalize this externality? It has something to do with decision making. Let's think about the firm's decision. The firm is making its decision on how much to produce based on what? When the firm sits down and says, how many units should we produce? They're thinking about what?
Cost of production.
They're thinking about their actual cost of production, which is tied to producer surplus, right? They're thinking about their actual costs of production. Right? They're saying, okay, labor is going to cost us this much, and our raw materials are this much, and this is what it's going to cost us, and this is what people are willing to pay. Do they sit down and say, you know, we should really price these significantly higher because of the pollution that's caused? Or we should really make ourselves impose new technological requirements and install scrubbers on our smokestack, even though we're not required to? Is that how businesses think? No, now I'm not saying they never do anything because it's good for the environment. Please don't get me wrong. But generally, decision makers think about the expenses where money changes hands. In other words, they're thinking about their private marginal costs. They're thinking about their private marginal costs. And the private marginal costs that would weigh into their decision are going to be the things like the labor and the raw materials. And they're naturally going to think about those things, right? Does the market have to tell decision makers to think about these things? No, it's kind of inherent in their decision-making process. People know how to sit down and say, gosh, I got to cover this amount of labor, I got to cover this amount of raw materials. So this is the price, and this is how many I'm going to be able to sell. That's innate. That's how people make decisions. Can the market force decision makers to have the externality enter into their equation? Can the market force firms to internalize the externality? Does the market have any way to make firms think about this as a real cost? The market can't. Now, government can, but can the market? No. So we want to be very clear. The market can't force decision makers. So the market can't force decision makers to think about the externality in their decision process. The market doesn't have a way to do that. Hence the term externality. So this is really about modeling decision making. And while government can force us to think about or pay the cost of our externalities, right? Government can force us to pay more for gas, and they can force us to pay more for cigarettes. But the market can't, right? The market doesn't really have a mechanism. Because, let's go back to this previous graph. Let's take a look. In the marketplace, guys, which is the relevant supply curve? The black one or the purple one? The black one, right? Decisions are made on the black supply curve, right? And can the market say, hey, no, you know what? That's not the way to think about this, folks. You really need to think about the purple supply curve. Can the market pull that off? No. But can the government say, hey, for every unit, there's a little bit of externality. We're going to charge you a tax. The government can do that, right? Market cannot. Do you understand the distinction? So then understand, in our principles class, guys, so in Econ 217, when we said markets are efficient, and we did, right? Everyone remember that from Econ 217? We said markets are good, markets are efficient.
Did not have that class.
You didn't have Econ 217?
Was that micro?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I was going to say you had it because you can't be in here without it. It was like, wow. Okay. So guys, you guys remember us saying markets are good, markets are efficient. And we modeled it. We said, okay, P0 is efficient. Q0 is efficient, right? And so we said that the market's going to operate at E. We said that it's going to set a price P0. And it's going to exchange Q0 units. And we said if we let the market work, so we said, hey, if we just let the market work, if we don't interfere with the market and we just let it work, then it's going to allocate resources to where they're most highly valued. So we said markets are good. Markets are efficient. We said that markets are going to generate the socially optimal outcomes. And you guys all remember that from our principles of micro class. So what were we assuming away? What were we assuming away when we said this is good X? What were we assuming away? We were making a big assumption. What was it? What was
The
it?
externality was internalized?
Were we assuming that the externality was internalized?
That there was
No, because it can't be internalized. Say it again.
That there was no externality.
Ah, so we were assuming no externality, right? We were assuming that there was no externality, or certainly not one of any magnitude. So when we talked about markets in Econ 217 as being efficient, we assumed away the presence of any substantial externality. And maybe at the end of your class we said, okay, well there's a little more to the story. Maybe we covered a little bit about externalities, and some of you may have also learned about public goods, right? Things where markets aren't going to work. So last thing about this example then, guys. Last thing about this example. Let's go back and take a look. Everyone with me? Let's go back to this graph right here. We have a negative externality present. Everyone agree? We have a negative externality present. We agree that we have market failure. And everyone can articulate that, right? You understand what we mean by market failure. The market's not resulting in the socially optimal or efficient level of output. But I want to know one thing more. What's the nature of the market failure here? Is the market overproducing or underproducing in this example? So is the market over or under producing? Is the market over or under producing, folks? Is it producing too much or too little? The market is producing too much, right? Everyone agree with that? The market's producing too much relative to the socially optimal level. So is it the market overproducing or underproducing? What's the answer, guys? Is it overproducing or underproducing? So the market is overproducing, right? Overproducing relative to the socially optimal level. It's allocating too many resources to the production of this task, right? Because the socially optimal level is Q1, but the market's producing Q0. The market is over allocating, it's overproducing. Everybody with me there? So the market produces too much. And if the market's producing too much, it can't be efficient. So that's the case of a negative externality or an external cost. Everybody with me? Okay. So let's look at the case of an external benefit. Case of external benefits, let's use the example of an immunization. We agree that an immunization creates spillover benefits for everyone you come into contact with. So an immunization creates spillover benefits for everyone you come into contact with. So let's look at individual decision making. Let's look at the individual decision. All right. So we've got a downward sloping marginal benefit curve. And let's just stay with our upward sloping marginal cost. It could be constant. It doesn't really matter. We'll do some examples with constant marginal cost. Let's go back to our simple marginal benefit, marginal cost model. So again, my decision, I'm trying to decide, do I get my flu shot? Do I get my other immunizations? So what's my decision? Everyone agree that I'm going to weigh my private marginal benefits versus my private marginal cost. Do you think that most people, when they decide to get a flu shot, for example, that they're basically weighing their own costs and benefits? You know, maybe I think about my husband, my kids. Kids don't live with me, so I'm probably not thinking about them, but maybe I think about my husband. But do you agree that for the most part I'm thinking about the benefits to myself? So these private marginal benefits are the benefits that accrue directly to me. So I'm going to weigh my private marginal benefits and the private marginal cost. What's it going to cost me? And I'm going to make my decision. But guys, are there external benefits? Are there external benefits when I get a flu shot? So I'm standing up in front of you and I'm not, right? Poor Sandy's right here in the front row, so he's going to get it when I come in sick, right? So we do want to remember that there are some external benefits when I get this shot. There are some external benefits. Do I take those into account? Do you think I take those into account, guys? I mean, maybe for just my immediate household, but do you think I'm thinking about you guys when I decide to get my flu shot? I like y'all, but that probably doesn't come into my cost-benefit analysis. I'm not doing it for you, I'm doing it for me. So these probably don't enter my decision process. These probably don't enter my decision process. But nevertheless, there are these marginal benefits. So we'll call these the MEBs, the marginal external benefits. But I make my decision based on my private marginal benefits and marginal cost. Everyone agree with that? So do you agree when I make my decision, I'm making it based on these factors? Oops. Am I thinking about those marginal external benefits? No. Now, if I did think about the marginal external benefits, then I'd be thinking about this curve right here, where we have the marginal benefits that are private plus the marginal external benefits. So if I did think about all those spillover benefits that I generate when I get a flu shot, I'd be thinking entirely differently. I'd be thinking about that red marginal benefit curve, right? Which means I'd be thinking about this. I'd be willing to pay a price P1, and I'd get more immunizations, right? Is that how I think though? No. So if the marginal external benefits did enter my decision process, I'd be willing to pay the higher price P1, and I'd get more shots. But people don't behave that way, right? People don't behave that way. People don't behave that way. So now let's do the same thing and let's expand this to look at a market. Instead of just looking at my private individual decision, and you're going to see it's going to work the same way. So let's let this be the market for immunizations. And we've got our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. And again, remember that demand curve captures private marginal benefits. And the supply curve captures marginal cost. All right. So in this market, guys, based on supply and demand, do you agree we're going to operate right here? So the market's going to price immunizations at P0. And there's going to be Q0 immunizations exchanged. Have we incorporated the externality? No. So we need to remember that the market fails to incorporate the spillover benefits. Can we estimate spillover benefits, guys? Do people do that? Sure. So let's assume that somebody's been hired and they've estimated. So let's assume we can estimate the spillover benefits. So let's assume that we can estimate the spillover benefits. So we're going to generate a marginal external benefit curve. So basically we're capturing the externality in a marginal way, incrementally. And let's say that we know that there's a spillover benefit with every one of these immunizations. Which gives us a new demand curve. So we took the old demand curve plus the marginal external benefits, and we got this new demand curve, D1. And D1, what did we call it when we did it on the supply curve? Remember? Flip back at your notes, and we said we're going to take the supply curve, add in the marginal external cost, and that gave us supply curve S1. What did we call that? The social supply curve. So what have we just generated here? The social demand curve, exactly. We've just generated a social demand curve. So the red curve is our social demand curve. And if we're operating on our social demand curve, then instead of being at P0, we would see a higher price, but we really don't want to focus so much on that part. We want to focus on this increase in quantity. So what do we see here, guys? That the market is going to end up with Q0 units. But the socially optimal is Q1 units. So do we see market failure here, guys? So we see market failure. And we see market failure. Why? Give me an intuitive explanation. Why do we see market failure? What's happening that's causing this market failure? Don't just say because Q0 and Q1 are different. Why is it happening? Intuitively. What's causing this?
Because people don't think of the benefits.
Because people are making decisions based on their private benefits, right? So people make decisions based on their private benefits. And they ignore the external benefits in their decision making. Those private marginal benefits here could be really big, right? Especially for somebody like me. I teach tons of students, right? I've got students in and out of my office all day long. You guys are in a dining hall with a bunch of students. You live with somebody else. You live in a dorm near a whole bunch of people. The potential for the externality here is quite large. Everyone agree? But do I say, I'm willing to pay more for this because I'm going to have spillover benefits for all kinds of students? I don't say that. And do I say, gosh, I'm going to get even more immunizations? There's other things I could get. But again, that's not how I behave. So then we see market failure. We all agree. What's the nature? If I ask you, what's the nature of the market failure here? Is the market producing too much or too little? The market's producing too few, right? Does everyone agree? The market produces too little. The market outcome is less immunizations than is socially optimal. So the market underproduces. We might say the market underallocates. So guys, just using the market forces, can we get to Q1? Can the market force people to change the way they make decisions? Can the market force people to think about that red demand curve? Guys, does that red demand curve even really exist in the minds of decision makers? No, it's just an abstraction, right? It's just me kind of showing you what if we could estimate the externality, then we'd want people to behave this way, right? So then guys, if we have market failure and externalities, which we just said we do, So we see market failure. In the process of immunizations, and we just said the market can't solve this problem. Then how do we address it? How do we address it, Graham?
Subsidies?
One way would be possibly subsidies. So remind me, somebody, what's a subsidy? And is that a market process? Is that a market process? No. It's a governmental process, right? So this would be a government process. So we're going to subsidize immunizations. It's a government process. Be very clear. It's not a market process. The market's not giving the subsidies. The government's giving the subsidies. And when we do that, what happens? Let's take a look. So we know that the market is operating here. But now we subsidize. What does that do, guys?
The price goes down,
Okay,
and
price is going to go down.
demand goes up.
Demand goes up. I disagree with that statement.
Fund and
Okay, how do I draw a subsidy? How do I draw a subsidy? A subsidy is not a quota.
no.
I just felt like the
Oh.
graph, like,
A graph like the quota? No, remember a quota is a fixed quantity. Subsidy is not a fixed quantity.
Doesn't it go up and then go straight?
No, that's a quota. This is not a quota graph, guys.
Doesn't it just shift the demand curve?
All right, well does it shift the demand curve? Well, let's make it simple.
Right?
Let's give a subsidy to suppliers. Let's make it simple. I could do it either way. What do we remember, guys, about a supply curve? A supply curve is capturing marginal costs, right? So now we've given a subsidy to suppliers. We've given a subsidy to suppliers. Guys, put your phones away. So what happens to their marginal cost?
Goes down.
If I'm handing a firm money to defray some of their costs, what happens to their marginal cost? It goes down, right? So what's the subsidy doing? What am I shifting if I'm handing the subsidy to the suppliers?
Bring up the price down.
It shifts that supply curve, right? It shifts that supply curve, right? The subsidy shifts the supply curve. So now we're operating at price P1, right? And quantity is Q1. So the subsidy given to suppliers, and I do have to be specific, right, because we could subsidize in other ways. I think that's maybe what you were talking about when you were talking about demand shifting, which would be right. I'm generally going to model it this way because I think it's a little more intuitive for you. So let's take a look back at what we wanted to have happen. We wanted to get from Q0 to Q1. And we can't do it by just having a demand increase simply by appealing to people. Oh, you're helping all those people around you get shots. You're going to keep everyone else from getting sick. That's not going to work. So look at this graph. We want to be at Q1, right? This is the socially efficient, socially optimal output level. And now look at our next graph. Did we achieve that? With the right subsidy, did we achieve it? Yeah. So remember, before, we saw market failure. And we saw market failure because the market underallocated. It produced Q0. And what did the subsidy do? The subsidy caused output to go up, right? So the subsidy caused output to go up, right? Everyone agree? So subsidies are a way that we can promote something that's good for the environment. Now guys, is that how we handled it for you guys? You want to come to Longwood University. What do you have to do? What did you have to submit to the university? You had to submit a form that said that you had gotten immunized. Did we subsidize you? No. So that tells us a second approach could be what?
Regulation.
Yeah, some kind of regulation, right? There could be some kind of regulation. And a good example of that would be Longwood requiring immunizations. You had to get your shots. And you had to turn in paperwork. Unless you were claiming a religious exemption, you had to turn in paperwork. Now, how many of you have, I don't know if you can still see mine, how many of you have, you might have, one of those little scars here? Well, I don't even remember what it was for. But when I was in elementary school, and maybe this is the same for you, Xavier, but when I was in elementary school, they lined us all up in the cafeteria. And they immunized every one of us. I don't think they do that now. They certainly didn't do it for my children, and maybe they decided it's not appropriate, but they lined us all up and gave us immunizations. Which category would that fall into, 1 or 2? Maybe 2. But if they lined us all up and gave us free immunizations, then it's also a subsidy, right? It was a subsidy basically subsidizing the suppliers and maybe mandating, I don't know, that we had to have it. All right, so last question then, guys. Last question before we wrap this up. Let's go back to our example of our factory emitting pollution. Back to our example of a factory emitting pollution. If the market can't get us to the socially optimal point, what could we do? What could we do? So how would we solve the market failure? We just talked about how we would solve it. How would we address it when we had a negative externality? We just did it for a positive externality.
Regulate how much pollution.
So we could use a tax, right? And again, that's not a market outcome, that's a government strategy, right? We could have a tax. And what's the second option? Regulation. Guys, do we see both of those approaches? Yeah. We impose environmental taxes, and we also have environmental regulation. So we don't have to rely on firms saying, oh, I think I'll install technology to eliminate the pollution. Instead, they simply have to do it. So guys, very quickly, you need to make sure you understand, because you're going to probably be doing some homework on this tonight. You need to make sure that you can understand the following. You need to be able to explain market failure when there's a negative externality present, market failure when there's a positive externality present. You need to be able to show it graphically. You need to be able to explain it intuitively. And you need to be able to explain how to generate efficiency. In other words, what would be an equation? that describes efficiency. I want you to be thinking about that. All right. Then 2, I want you to think about how do you solve or address the market failure. All right. All right. Make sure you can do all that.
I was in the bathroom.